today I will try to reframe the problem of misinformation. And one thing I will do is I will challenge common alarmist narratives around misinformation. Notably, I will challenge the idea that people consume a lot of misinformation, that people are gullible and believe anything, and that misinformation has detrimental effects on important things like voting behaviors or vaccine hesitancy. So my first argument will be that misinformation consumption is actually low, and there have been many studies now showing that the average internet users in Western democracies consume very little misinformation, and these studies use very liberal definitions of misinformation and include anything that comes from news outlet or source that have low standards of journalistic credibility or transparency, like anything that's low quality is considered misinformation in these studies. And all these studies show that misinformation consumption is very low. And I will give an example that I did myself at Oxford. So we looked at news consumption during the pandemic in the US, UK, France, and Germany. And we looked at it on Facebook and on people's browser and cell phone. In dark green and in green are news outlets that are considered to be reliable, like the New York Times or the BBC or France Info, for instance. And in red and orange are news outlets that have lower standards of journalistic transparency and credibility, and basically don't always produce false information, but produce lower quality information. What we can see in all these graphs is that in March 2020, in all the countries, there has been a surge in news consumption. So when the World Health Organization announced that we were facing a pandemic, people consume more news. But what we can see is that this increase mostly was focused on the most reliable news outlets, such as the BBC and the New York Times. And that on Facebook, the picture is much less clear. And in some countries, we can see that low quality information is quite popular, like in France or in the UK. But on average, what we see is that the pandemic increased news consumption, but that it mainly benefited the most reliable news outlets. So on average, on all these studies that I've quickly passed, the consensus is that in the Western democracy, unreliable news, like low quality news, represent 5% of people's news diet, like of all the news that they consume, and approximately less than 1% of all the information that people consume, including not only news, but all other forms of information. But I think what's important in this debate is also to put news itself in perspective. In France, the average internet user spends less than 5 minutes a day consuming news online, which represent less than 3% of the time that they spend on the internet. For instance, people in France and in other countries spend more time consuming pornography online than consuming news online. And of course, you have a lot of other things that people do, like entertainment, online shopping. Like people do a bunch of other things that are completely unrelated to news. And I think as academics or politicians or people interested in these things, we tend to think that people are like super interested in news, super interested in politics. But the reality is that most people have very little interest in news and very little interest in politics, even during political campaigns. And basically, the picture is the same in the US. Like news consumption online is very, very small. And actually, what many scholars are concerned about is that many people don't consume news at all or consume very little news. And there is also concerns about political news, and in particular, partisan political news. But as you can imagine, if news consumption is super small, political news consumption is even smaller, and partisan political news consumption is even smaller, to the point that it's almost undetectable. I think there are implications of these findings for the way we think about the problem of misinformation. And one of them, which is I think the most important one in this talk, is that many people will hold false beliefs, not because they have been exposed to misinformation and believed it, the gullible explanation kind of, but simply because they have not been exposed to reliable information or disbelieved reliable information, kind of the skepticism hypothesis. And given the low prevalence of misinformation, interventions that are trying to reduce acceptance of misinformation are bound to have small effects, especially when we compare it to intervention that would try to increase belief in reliable information or consumption of reliable information. And of course, ideally, to even increase the quality of information itself. With colleagues, we have tried to demonstrate that with some small models showing that given the low prevalence of misinformation and that not everyone accepts misinformation, increasing slightly the acceptance of reliable information would be much more impactful on the overall accuracy of people's beliefs than trying to fight misinformation. And I'm also worried that many of the interventions that are designed to fight misinformation, they start from the premise that people are gullible and that we need to teach them to be more critical. But I'm worried that because people will use all these skills on reliable information, because people are mainly exposed to reliable information, so I'm worried that this will create cynicism. And I will come back to that later, but I think a problem is that people are actually too cynic towards the news and politics. And so these interventions that are trying to make people more critical, they are betting against the odds that given the low prevalence of misinformation, true positive, like rejecting or not accepting misinformation, will be more likely than false positive, which is incorrectly rejecting reliable information, and I'm worried about that. So the second point is that people are not gullible and that they are instead stubborn, and I think that's a problem. So most of this part is based on the book of my supervisor, Hugo Mercier, and this seminal article by Dan Sperber, Epistemic Vigilance. So if you want to know more, I really recommend the book. And where I come from is, so I have a background in cognitive science and psychology, but I have been really inspired and influenced by the work in political science on persuasive effects, and for instance, the effect of political campaigns or advertisement on people. And basically, all these studies have shown that the effects of persuasion are extremely small, and that persuasion do happen, but that the effects are very small. It's hard to persuade people. And so I come also from Reuters, so I've been also very influenced by all these surveys they do around all countries, and what they have found through the last decades is that trust in news is low and is declining. And that people are able to distinguish reliable source from unreliable source in the sense that there is a strong correlation between how much fact checker trust news outlets and how much people do. So people are not so bad, there is a strong correlation. But something that we have seen, for instance, in the US, so don't look into the detail, but basically the idea is that there is a correlation, but that fact checkers trust reliable news outlets much more than people do. So basically, people trust the news, but they trust it less than experts whose job is to evaluate the quality of these news outlets. And a lot of worries about misinformation are, I think, wrongly targeted on social media, but I think there is a lot of evidence that people trust news on social media even less, because they are skeptical of the way algorithms present news to them, but because in general, people are skeptical of information they find on social media, much more than information they find on news websites. And this is just an example. For instance, during the pandemic, in 6 countries, people were asked how much do you trust information about the coronavirus on social media, and only 26% say that they trust information about COVID-19 on social media, and 40% distrust it. Another line of evidence is that in the last 6 years, there have been a lot of work experimentally exposing people to true and false news and asking them to rate how accurate they think each headline is, even though they don't know it. You just give them a headline, you're like, how accurate do you think the headline is? And with a colleague, we have meta-analyzed all these results of 50 articles exposing people to a lot of true and false information. And what we find is that, on average, people can discern from true from false news, so people rate true news as much more accurate than false news. But basically, people tend to make the mistake of rating true news as false more often than they make the mistake of rating false news as true. So people are a bit conservative in their judgment, and I think it's well illustrated, for instance, in the word of these participants saying, I'd rather not believe something that is true than believe something that is actually false. So people tend to have a kind of conservative and skeptical position, which of course can be beneficial in some media ecosystems. Like if the quality of the information environments you're in, you'd better be conservative. But in most Western countries, people are not in these low quality environments. There is also a literature totally unrelated to that that's focused on social learning, like how humans learn from either their own experience and like trial and error, or from what they see others doing, like observations. And what all these studies find basically is that we put much more weight on our own beliefs, our own trial and error, our own experience, rather than that of others, even when others are as expert as we are. So basically, we trust ourselves more than we trust others, even when we have no reasons to distrust others and think that we are more competent than others. So again, it's called egocentric discounting, and it's just our tendency to favor what we think over what others think, even when we have no reasons to trust them less. And I think people who believe in misinformation are actually the most skeptical. They are what some philosophers have called epistemic individualists. They encourage everyone to think for themselves, to do their own research, and basically not trust anyone. They also fact-check the fact-checkers a lot on social media. Like they put a lot of effort into understanding what's going on, and most often they are wrong, but they put a lot of efforts into fact-checking fact-checkers and trying to understand what's really going on. And they reject anything related to the establishment. I think this has a number of implications for the way we think about misinformation, and one of them is that there is more room to improve trust in reliable source than to reduce trust in unreliable source. And by reliable source, I not only mean like good quality news outlets like the BBC or the New York Times, but I also mean source on the internet like Wikipedia, who a lot of people distrust for bad reasons, even teachers, for instance, in France. And I think there is a lot of room to improve trust in these high quality sources rather than to reduce trust in unreliable sources that most people don't even know. And the people who know them, they have good reasons to go on them, but that's for the next slides. And I think instead of teaching lay people to be more critical than they already are, in most contexts, at least in Western democracies, I think it would be more fruitful to make them more trusting of reliable sources. And I think the last point I'm going to make is that misinformation often is a symptom of other problems rather than a cause of these problems. And that we tend to conflate correlation and causation when we see a lot of problems and there is always misinformation, and we think, oh, it must be misinformation, and I think we are wrong. So I will make three small arguments in this part. One of them is that a small minority of active users account for most of the visit to unreliable news websites, and that counter discourses fostered by misinformation mainly attract some specific group of people who have a very low trust in institutions and have high partisan animosity, and that misinformation is often used to fulfill social goals, such as denigrating political opponents, and that people instrumentally use misinformation to do these goals. So in the studies I've shown you before, there has been a lot of work on who consumes misinformation, and all these studies, what they find is that on Twitter or Facebook, you have a very small amount of people who account for most of the misinformation we see, and we see consumed on social media. And for instance, during the 2016 presidential election, most misinformation that was consumed on Facebook was pro-attitudinal, in the sense that it's, for instance, Trump supporters sharing and consuming news that favor Trump or the opposite. But it's pro-attitudinal. It's not people consuming things they disagree with, it's people already consuming and sharing things they already agree with. And so you can imagine that the causal impact of doing that is necessarily small because people already agree with this information, so it can maybe radicalize them a little bit, but it cannot do much. And in the US, on Facebook in particular, what we see is that it's mostly older Republicans or older conservatives that consume most and share most of the misinformation on Facebook. And it has been increasingly clear that people on social media share misinformation to fulfill partisan goals, but it's true of a lot of information, even like fact-checking. Like people share fact-checking that denigrate political opponents make a political point. And people share misinformation a lot because they are simply angry at the government. Like, people angry at the government will often, in Western democracies, share misinformation to burn the establishment, to basically to show also that they are angry. I've also done some work showing that people can use misinformation, like conspiracy theories, for instance, to show that they are dominant. And when we see, for instance, the most prominent actors in this domain, they look like very dominant. And a lot of these conspiracy theories are like angry, and they are very masculine. And there is a lot of masculinity in these conspiracy theories. And I think a lot of people share them to show that they have these properties. But on the other hand, there is also a lot of misinformation that's much nicer, such as all the misinformation about health and yoga and homeopathy and all these benefits of these very nice things. And I think people share these things also to show that they are nice and to show that they care. And often, in many cases, it doesn't really hurt. Of course, there are many cases in which it hurts, but for instance, doing more yoga or eating more lemon or doing things like that won't hurt a lot, but it shows that you're nice, that you care about others, that you have alternative solutions that are not cold, like the traditional medicine. So I think a lot of people share these happy, natural remedies to show that they are nice. And so the main point is that people are motivated to engage with misinformation. People actively look for misinformation. They use it to define themselves, and they proudly harbor it. Like, it's in their definition, like they define themselves as conspiracy believers, for instance. And I think a lot of the metaphors that we use to think about misinformation are very passive. It's the idea that people fall in the rabbit hole, that people are being influenced by some stuff. But I do think that these metaphors are wrong, and that people don't fall in the rabbit hole, they jump in and they dig. Like, people are very active in the process, and we need to at least give them that. Like, they put a lot of energy to do that. And I very much agree with Bennett and Livingstone, saying that we should resist easy efforts to make the problem go away by fact-checking initiatives and educating citizens about the perils of fake news. Many citizens actively seek such information to support identities and political activities, and we need to account for that when thinking about misinformation and the solutions to the problem. And that's a study in France, for instance, on the French Twitter. And basically what they did is they looked at, so before COVID, they looked at the people who were climate denialists, like they think climate change doesn't really happen or it's not a big problem. They looked at them and they mapped them, and there were like 30,000 on the French Twitter. And then they looked at what happened during the COVID pandemic. And basically 70% of these people became anti-vax, so they were skeptical of the vaccine, didn't want to take the vaccines. And then the invasion of Ukraine happened, and these people shared Russian propaganda. So there is a continuum. Like, these people before the COVID, they were climate denialists, then they were anti-vax, now they share Russian propaganda. And basically, these people don't really care about the content. What they care is that it goes against the establishment. And the establishment think that climate change is a problem, so they are saying it's not a problem. The establishment is trying to vaccinate them, so they are against it. The establishment is in favor of Ukraine, so they are in favor of Russia. And you can put many other topics, and it will still be the same. They will just take the opposite position of the mainstream and the establishment, and the content doesn't matter. It just matters that they are going to oppose. And the implication is that there will be misinformation as long as people do not trust institutions, are angry at institutions, or are, for instance, affectively polarized. And I think most interventions against misinformation are doomed to play a game of whack-a-mole, where you can debunk as much as you want. As long as people have these motivations to believe what they do and share what they do, it's not going to do much. Like, it's going to alleviate the symptom for a little bit, and we may feel good about ourselves, and we may feel a bit better, and the information environment may be a bit better, but it's soon going to be back to normal. And I think that we need more systemic solutions, such as building trust, cultivating interest in the news, and reducing partisan animosity, as it could help address the root causes of the problem. But of course, these are not all the root causes. There are deeper root causes, like, for instance, if the information ecosystem is not of good quality, then we would need to improve this quality, and the news may perhaps need to change how they do stuff. Same for political organizations. So I'm not putting all the blame on people. I'm also well aware that there are problems with institutions, even in Western democracies. And my final point is just about the causal influence of misinformation. And it's much inspired by this very good paper by, so it's a philosopher paper called Intuitive and Reflexive Beliefs. But what I just want you to come out of this conference with is just that there are different kinds of beliefs, and not all beliefs have the same causal influence on our behaviors or on our attitudes. And I'm going to take the example of a cucumber. Imagine your kid and your teacher tells you that cucumber is made out of 99% of water. So you have the intuitive beliefs that the cucumber is a solid and that you can hold it and you can eat it. But at the same time, your teacher, whom you trust, told you the cucumber is basically water. It's made out of water and it's 99% of water. But what do you make with these beliefs? Like, you have these two beliefs in your head that the cucumber is a solid, that you can eat it like that, but at the same time, you believe that cucumber is mostly water. And this belief that cucumber is mostly water doesn't freely interact with all the beliefs in your head. It's something that you hold, as Dan would say, in parentheses. So it's something you have in your head. And I do believe that many false beliefs that people have about like flat Earth, like what does it mean the Earth to be flat? The Earth is flat. Like, it doesn't mean much. It doesn't affect our behavior. It's not going to change how I walk in the street. It's not going to change whether I take the plane. Like, it has no influence on any of my behavior. But I do have this belief that I hold in parentheses. And when I work on it, I can try to draw some inferences. But naturally, my intuitive systems won't take this belief as true. Whereas the intuitive belief that the cucumber is a solid, if you throw me a cucumber, I will try to catch it, even though I have the belief that it's water. I'm not going to expect to be splashed by a cucumber. And I do think, for instance, that the Pizzagate, so this conspiracy theory that there were child trafficking in this pizzeria, many people in the US reported believing that. And I do believe that it was mostly a reflexive belief in the sense of people saying, in this pizzeria that I've never been in, there is some very bad things happening with children. But this guy, I think, is one of the only one who had an intuitive belief about it and who really believed that there were kids there because he took his gun to save the kids. And that's something you expect from people who has an intuitive belief about it. Whereas many other people just went to the pizzeria and then left a very bad review saying that the pizza was a bit cold and the waiters were a bit weird, like maybe I should not bring my kids there. But if you really have the intuitive belief that there are kids being enslaved in the pizzeria, you don't go there with your kids. And I really like also the work of this journalist saying that one of the great ironies of the truth movement, like QAnon and this stuff, is that its activists typically hold their meetings in large, unsecured locations, such as college auditoriums, even as they insist that the government agents, who are extremely powerful, of course, will stop at anything to protect their conspiracy for world domination from discovery. So a lot of people in Western democracies who believe in crazy conspiracy theories will do everything publicly, are very public and very vocal about it, whereas we know that when there are real conspiracies and when people are really scared, they basically don't talk, and you need incentives to make them talk, and they are private, and so basically they are scared of talking about it. Whereas in Western democracies, a lot of conspiracy believers are very vocal about it, which is not what you expect from people who have really intuitive beliefs about it. And I do believe that as soon as we have a societal problem, like the rise of populism, anti-vaccinations, anti-democratic attitudes, Brexit, climate denialism, all these things, as soon as you have a problem, you will have misinformation. There is a lot of misinformation about all these things, and about any big societal problem, you have misinformation, but I do believe that it's a symptom of the same problem that gave rise to all these problems. It's not the cause of it. The way I see it is that misinformation basically is the tip of the iceberg. It's what you get when you have many problems. Again, it's not really indicative of the problem that you have. Like, you can have inequalities, polarization, lack of trust, cognitive biases, anti-democratic attitudes, racism, sexism. You can have many forms of societal problems that are big and real, but that will cause misinformation. But when you see misinformation, you don't know what the problem is. And in the literature on conspiracy theory, they have this nice metaphor also of the tree and the roots, and that all what people say, like vaccines are toxic, GM food is wrong and not healthy, I don't believe in climate change, all these basically are just what we see are the leaves and the branches, but if they come from these worldviews, they come from people's values, people's ideologies, and people's identity, many complex things that give rise to all these branches and these leaves. And you can cut the leaves and you can cut the branches as much as you want. If the roots are still here, the leaves and the branches will regrow every year. And at the country level, I think that we can see misinformation as a thermometer, in the sense that the more you have misinformation, the more you know you have problems in this country. You don't know, again, where the problems exactly come from, but you can be sure that there may be problems with democratic institutions, because we know, for instance, that people who believe more in, people in more corrupt countries believe more in conspiracy theories and in misinformation. So more corruption, more belief in conspiracy theories, and it makes a lot of sense, because in countries in which the elite is corrupt, you have good reason to distrust them, and you have good reason to think that there are actually conspiracies happening. And so what do? I think what we want to do is just to fight misperceptions, so false beliefs that are in people's head, causing or exacerbating socially detrimental behaviors, not misinformation per se, because misinformation has no causal effect. It can only have an effect if it goes into people's brain and if people accept it and act on it. So I'm not a big fan of focusing on misinformation. I'd rather focus on misperceptions, even though most of our misperceptions, of course, have no effect on our behavior or nothing, but some of them do, like vaccine hesitancy and stuff like that. So we should focus on that rather than misinformation. And misperception, which is, I think, one of the most important points, is that can be caused by the acceptance of misinformation, which is what we usually focus on, but also more commonly by the rejection of reliable information, or simply by the avoidance of reliable information. We know in democratic countries, for instance, more and more people are avoiding the news, they're avoiding the BBC, they're avoiding the New York Times, and I think that it's creating a lot of misperceptions, because then people are being less informed about what's happening, about political systems, about what elites are doing, etc. And that many more people are uninformed because they don't follow the news, rather than misinformed because they consume misinformation. And thank you very much.
Sacha. Well, hello. Sacha, thank you for your really excellent presentation, I would say. And now it's time for a question, so if there are any.
Sorry for asking so much, but what do you think, Rector? Excellent presentation. What do you think about the proliferation of fact-checkers that don't even have a college? This has been a huge problem in Czech Republic. Many people just came up to YouTube or Twitter and or TikTok and get lots of audience by fact-checking and going around schools and lecturing on fact-checking without even having a college. Is this something which is going to last, or it is a phenomenon which will disappear?
So you're talking about incompetent fact-checkers, because I have nothing against fact-checkers. I do think fact-checking can have some positive effects, notably by holding politicians accountable. So I'm not totally against fact-checking, and I don't think it's totally useless. I'm not very competent about the topic of incompetent fact-checkers. I mean, it sounds bad, but I mean, many journalists, I think, may not be super competent, but because they are in good teams, and I mean, many of them do good work of fact-checking. So I think it's probably hard to know who is a competent or incompetent fact-checkers. But to be honest, I don't really know much about the topic of incompetent fact-checkers.
Well, can I elaborate? Well, it has become a sort of a job. Because you could get even paid for being a fact-checker, or at least getting lots of views and lots of advertisement money from these YouTubes and so on. A typical reaction to fact-checker is, please, could you show me your CV? Are you an expert in the topic you are trying to fact-check? And they don't even have these scientific credentials. So what about this? Is it a specific for Czech Republic, or does it take place in other places in the world?
I mean, to be honest, I've not seen it happening in France. In the US, at least the fact-checking organizations I know do a pretty good job. And I'm not sure you need to be exactly like expert in biology of like or GMOs like to to write a fact-checking article, that you just need to talk to the right people and do your journalistic work. So, but I mean, it's a very interesting topic. Now I'm interested in the business of incompetent fact-checkers, and I'd like to read more about it.
Oh, thank you so much. Oh, thank you so much for that fascinating presentation. Coming from the United States, I would have to say in the recent past, disinformation and misinformation have overtaken hate speech as the most controversial speech that most people want to restrict. You have just a cornucopia of information. I hope that you'll share your slides. So I have many questions, but one that jumped out at me were slides that you had about the small impact of spending money. And I think you were focusing on political ads, but I've also seen similar surveys about commercial advertising. And when I try to make that point, including in the context of money in politics, and does it really matter how much you spend? Does it really have an impact on the election? People will say to me, well, it must work because all of these people are so economically and financially sophisticated, and why would they spend all of that money if it didn't work? So what's your answer to that?
I mean, I think a lot of the hype about advertisement, political campaigns, like I think people overestimate the effects of that. But I think in general, when you survey like politicians, for instance, on what a treatment effect will have, they overestimate the treatment effect. Like I think politicians and probably people in marketing often overestimate how easy it is to change things and how much of a... So I do think that there is a lot of overestimation. I'm not exactly an expert on that, but I know I've read like a few books on them. And for instance, when they try to do like really randomized control trials, often they will talk to the boss and he will be like, are you crazy? Like if we don't do this advertisement in this county or in this, like if we try to do a randomized control trials, they think they will lose so much money, then often they just don't really properly causally test the effect of these advertisements and all these political campaigns. So yeah, I do think that it's a huge bubble, and it's a bit more complicated, but because maybe they try to achieve other things than persuasion. Maybe they try to like change how people see the brand and stuff like that, but often it also backfires. So no, yeah, I do think a lot of money invested in advertisement and political campaign is probably wasted.
Okay, another question here.
Hello. Thank you for excellent presentation. I have two questions actually, and allow me 2 short comments before each of the question. First, we all agree with a decline of newspapers being read, TV, news, evening, it's going down. However, there is not much statistics, real statistics, about local hybrid media systems, which are combined with global media systems, etc. So I can imagine people are posting on Facebook's communities, local communities like Můj Záhřeb, Most or Plzeňáci. You know, we have such a 50,000 of people there also about walking their dogs, about cooking, and they're hey, like Ukrainian, so I write comments. So that's also news, and they have community there because they write somebody is bad, somebody angry, etc. So how this decline of MSM media and public media just correlates with a rise and power of hybrid local media systems. People, there are 2 million of TikTok users in the Czech Republic now, but many elderly don't have it, but they share the videos, like misinformation videos. And second question, or conservatives. On my observation, there is ideologically, because of fragmentation, now it's quite difficult to label these Czech misinformation holders and spreaders of misinformation as old conservatives. Of course, they are against LGBT, they are against gender agendas, and they are like against globalizations. They think about win-loss. You know, we lost, they win. But I found out that there are many, actually, people combined together. They share videos from communists, democratic socialists, pacifists, don't give money to Ukraine, you know, because the bloody war is continuing. And combined with other esoteric people, libertarians, anti-COVID measures, and measures against news, disinformation spread, it should be banned, you know. So there's bunch of ideological background which is not readable for me easily to be old conservatives. So 2 questions, old conservatives and the others, and mixture of other ideologies, including esoterics and astrologists, etc., included in it, because you have mentioned the yoga issue. And first, the local hybrid media system and its power. Thank you.
So regarding the first question, I think it's quite difficult. At least I've done some work recently on participation with news, like in 50 countries, how much people over time do report, like engaging with news, like liking news on social media, like talking about the news, these things. And it's basically going down in many countries, like many people report less and less over time engaging with news, like participating with news online. So I don't, but then of course it's about news, it's not about their dogs and stuff like that, but I think no one would include that in the news category. But of course, people on social media mostly talk about non-news topics, about their dogs, about their children and stuff, and this is probably pretty stable, even though people are more and more aware of the context collapse and the fact that when you share something on social media, it can be seen by many others, and people are more and more reluctant to share like things publicly to a lot of people, even though TikTok is a counter argument. And to be honest, I'm not sure I've understood your second question. I thought it was more a comment, but maybe we can talk about it afterwards.
We
have time for one last question.
We have a question here. So.
We already have one. Okay, sorry.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I have to admit, I actually enjoyed reading your article on social media and society, not that long ago. And I do kind of concur with you on issues that we perhaps our political representations and civil services are overkilling the issue of misinformation and focusing too much in whack-a-mole game on fact-checking, focusing on the symptoms rather than the causes. But my 2 questions, well, one related to other, is more methodological, so I hope it's not going to be too boring. But from what I understood, reading some of your work, you mostly focus on the prevalence of misinformation, disinformation on social media and hard news. But does not that necessarily slightly underestimate, the prevalence of misinformation? Because, to many elder people, it gets, through chain emails and issues like that, which certainly is not to a large extent captured by many, existing, studies that have been published and I read so far. And it's also is related to a second, question, because these are very much related. Doesn't this also underestimate methodologically? Because we now know that recently there's been a research showing that when it comes to, for instance, our voting intentions, that you do have, socioeconomic characteristics, but what's very important is also the block of people around you, so friends, family, and you talk to them, and that's how you, can persuade others, voting for a party that they would not normally vote for because they're perhaps not that interested in politics and so on and so forth. So does this focus on, social media and news media and this, also underestimate, this kind of effect of, because chain emails can get to, people, elderly people, they meet with other elderly people, and, kind of, chain reaction of, so at the end of the day, even if I, concur with your conclusions, we're not necessarily, at least methodologically, capturing perhaps all the effects, or at least this is my question. Thank you.
Yeah, no, you're right. It's a very tough question, and there are improvements that are being made in this field of study. But as I said, I still think that many of the studies I've showed in the second slide use actually very, very liberal definitions of misinformation, in the sense that it's not only news, it's just even blog posts and like anything that talks about what's going on in the world are included in the studies, at least the one I did. For instance, we had like thousands and thousands of sources, and we not even focus on the ones that share false stuff, but just that have low standards of credibility and transparency. So basically, we know that they share low quality information on average. So I do think that regardless of the methodology that we use, false information is going to be small, but then low quality information in everyday language and stuff. If you go in the pub, for instance, after a few beers, of course, probably like it's going to be like 20% of the information we share is like low quality or almost misinformation. But I'm not super worried about that. And I do think that we are never going to find that, I don't know, 50% of what people say is misinformation. But of course, this is going to evolve, and it's an empirical question, so I may be totally wrong. But I also want to contrast with like some surveys. Like every year, you have many experts that make predictions, and for instance, in 2017, they predicted that in 2020, 80% or more of the information people would consume would be false, and it has not happened. And many people keep making these predictions, even about AI and stuff, and being like, yeah, in 5 years, everything we'll consume will be AI and will be false. And you're like, it's not going to happen. Like, I can put a lot of money on that, and we'll see in 5 years. Again, it's an empirical question, but let's say I'm just trying to challenge a lot of the alarmist narratives about it that make these very weird predictions, considering what we know about people. And because people basically are not stupid, like they have mechanism of epistemic vigilance that allow them to evaluate the information that's being communicated. And of course, you cannot spot falsehoods on the spot. Like if I tell you something false and you have no idea, you will believe it. But then maybe you will have feedback on it. And if you know that I've told you something that is false, you will trust me less in the past. And so we have basically all these mechanisms and social mechanisms that allow us to basically trust the right people and avoid consuming too much low-quality information. But of course, it's not perfect, and it depends on the information ecosystem, etc. But I do think that misinformation is not that big.
Okay, so once again, many thanks to Dr. Altay for his presentation.